Good morning. Thank you so much to the CAP folks for having us and putting together this amazing data set. I study state Supreme Courts primarily, and so for my dissertation, trying to get even 10 years worth of data from all 50 states was awful. And now we just have it since the founding, and it's incredible. And that's the project that I'm going to talk to you about today with Steve Morgan, who's a PhD candidate, and we're both in the Department of Political Science at Penn State. There's been a huge debate in the US over the last 20 years or so about whether judges should be elected or not. And the US is unique in that, along with Bolivia, we are the only country in the world that directly elects a good portion of its judges. And there are big concerns about whether or not these elected judges are worse than judges who come through appointment processes, right? They might be swayed in their decisions, and that could affect judicial independence. They could be systematically worse because maybe voters select on different traits than politicians do, and that has negative consequences for legal development. And the public might view these courts as less legitimate, which opponents of judicial elections seize on a lot when they talk about those. So the big project that Steve and I are working on is trying to parse differences in opinions that elected and appointed judges write. And we're going to kind of pick up very similar to where the last talk left off and talk about the readability of their opinions. So how clear is the law that these judges are producing? What's nice is that going back since the founding, we have lots of states that have switched selection methods over time. Almost every state has. Virginia's and some of the original colonies are the rare exception. And so we can compare both across state and over time. So there are 5 different methods that states use. And you can see this general upward sloping trend is the fact that since the founding, we have more and more states in the union. You see that originally, almost all states had originally all states had either a gubernatorial appointment or their judges were elected by the legislature. Then we started using partisan elections in the 1860s, and the number of partisan election states has gradually gotten smaller as states move to nonpartisan elections and this merit selection process where judges are chosen by a commission and they run in elections. So in a partisan election, judges run just like candidates for Congress do. Multiple candidates can appear on the ballot, party labels are on the ballot, you can vote for a Republican, you know who the Republican is. Nonpartisan elections, you have multiple candidates on the ballot, but you don't know what party they're from. So you just have to vote on the basis of name. And then in these merit selection states, they run in what are called retention elections, where a judge's name appears on the ballot and you can vote either yes or no. And you can imagine these different electoral rules give judges lots of different incentives for what they should be trying to do. So we think it might be the case that appointed judges might write better opinions, either because different sorts of lawyers are going to self-select into an appointment process versus going through the rigors of a campaign. Elected judges might be engaging in politics, and so they're going to write opinions just differently than appointed judges do. Incumbent elected judges are always worried about making a bad decision that can cost them at the election time, so worried about interest groups. And just how they write and how they articulate the law might vary based on whether they have those electoral incentives or not. So Steve's going to talk about the analysis we did.
Thanks, Michael. So for our data, we're going to use the CAP data set. Obviously, that's where we're here. We're looking at state high courts of last resort. So since the founding, we're not going to include any data from states during territorial times. And then to foreshadow our research design a little bit, we're relying on these readability measures that aren't necessarily useful on very short documents. So we're going to exclude opinions that are less than 100 words. Our initial results are at least robust to different thresholds of this. So this leaves us with just over 1.6 million opinions going back from the founding to almost present day. So as I just touched on, we're going to rely on decades of linguistics literature. Linguists have been pretty interested in quantifying text for decades now in terms of how difficult it is to read or comprehend. But these measures aren't really optimized for legal text specifically, so we're going to rely on sort of the wisdom of the masses here. So an example that we use is the Flesch-Kincaid score, which give you grade levels, 4th grade reading level versus 11th grade reading level. And then measures such as automated readability index, which is 0 to 100. So we use a dimension reduction technique, principal component analysis, to flesh out a single latent measure of readability. And we're pretty confident in this first dimension that we pull out. It accounts for just over 85% of the variance of these 17 different measures, and they load pretty well onto this. So this is what we're going to use for our modeling strategy. And because we're interested in the effects of these different selection strategies for judges on their opinions, we're just going to take the median values at each state year and model these as our dependent variable. So what this measure looks like over time, this is the first dimension for this readability measure for the high court opinions from the state of Massachusetts. It's mean centered at 0, relatively normally distributed. So in the early portion of this time series, high level of variance, this is mostly just due to a small number of cases compared to later years. We see this steady increase in stabilization right after the Civil War, and this slight decrease post-World War II. Looking at all states or all cases in the portion of the data set that we're using, the trends are pretty similar. So as I stated, it's a continuous variable. It's mean centered at 0, so we're going to use ordinary least squares regression to model this variable. So this is the bare bones model. Our x-axis here shows our coefficient estimates, and then we have coefficients for appointment elected state years, retention elected state years, and partisan elected state years. So nonpartisan elected state years are the reference group or the comparison. So we see that judges in retention elected state years produce higher reading difficulty scores compared to the other sort of selection method systems, while judges, kind of what we expected intuitively in partisan elected state years, are producing easier to read, less difficult opinions. So adding in just a few controls, the results sort of flesh out even more our theoretical expectations at the outset. So we see this jump here for appointed elected majority opinions at the highest level of reading difficulty, followed by retention election judges. And again, we have nonpartisan elected state years as the reference group. We have controls for case layered Democratic legislature because there are partisan differences on the use and validity of different selection methods. And then this general expenditure, just the amount that the state is spending in a specific year on their budget. So our initial conclusions, so we do find evidence that selection methods are in fact related to differences in opinion quality. And again, appointed judges are writing the highest quality or the most difficult, most legalese type of opinions, with partisan elected judges writing the lowest quality. And these have, we think, pretty important normative conclusions going back all the way to the progressive movement, with the idea that we should turn all systems of government to the people, increase democracy, democratic deliberation. But we're actually finding sort of inverse results here, that when individuals have the opportunity to elect their judges in a partisan setting with a political machine behind them, judges may be spending less time with their opinions, which is maybe why these measures are lower for partisan elected judges. They may be more vague, and part of this may be just because of differences in who is on the bench at this time. So our next steps, first, these models, even the second one that we presented, are still relatively bare bones. So we want more time and variant controls for state institutions. And we're kind of just generally looking at all different types of cases. So it'd be interesting to look at how these relationships may vary in, say, search and seizure cases versus religious liberties, to get a potential more nuance in how selection methods impact opinion quality. So thank you. We look forward to your comments afterwards.